I call the honourable member for Gippsland.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I rise to speak in relation to the Offshore Petroleum Greenhouse Gas Storage Legislation Amendment Bill, which seeks to correct omissions in the Act which came into effect last year and make a number of technical corrections. The bill has been in development since 2005 under the previous coalition government and has enjoyed bipartisan support. The Act authorises the transportation by pipeline and injection and storage of greenhouse gas substances in deep geological formations under the seabed. I have previously spoken to offer my general support for this legislation and the process it does seek to facilitate, which is the sequestration of greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide. In doing so, Deputy Speaker, I made the point that the Gippsland Basin, and the member for Crangamite touched on as well, that the Gippsland Basin is likely to play a critical role in the development of these new technologies. And for those who are unfamiliar with the Gippsland Basin, it's a major contributor to our nation, and the bill has particular relevance to my region. The Longford Gas Plant, which is located about 10 kilometres from the city of Sale, is responsible for supplying most of Victoria's gas requirements and about 20% of Australia's oil and gas supplies. I actually grew up in the city of Sale, and I well remember the impact of the oil and gas industry when it first came to my hometown. And this year, Deputy Speaker, marks the 40th anniversary of the joint venture partners SO-BHP and their work in Bass Strait. There was a function quite recently where, I think it was April 29th this year, as I recall, which was attended by the Minister for Resources and the Shadow Minister to commemorate this occasion. And it really was an auspicious occasion for the Gippsland region. We had the former member for Gippsland, the Honourable Peter Nixon, in attendance, and I wish him well, because it actually marked a very critical date in our community's development. And it's hard to imagine the Gippsland region today without the discovery of oil and gas in the early 60s. Such has been the profound impact of the industry in terms of its economic contribution to the region and also its contribution to the social and the cultural life of the Gippsland community. SO has been a long-standing benefactor to the community with a range of donations to community and sporting activities, perhaps most notably with the recent completion in the last few years of the Wellington Entertainment Centre in Sale. Now, I don't seek to give the House a comprehensive history lesson on the Bass Strait oil and gas fields, but it is important in the context of this debate. The offshore drilling began in 1960 when BHP was granted petroleum exploration permits. In 1967, Kingfish 1 was drilled and encountered Australia's largest oil field with 1.2 billion barrels recoverable. By the end of 1969, 11 fields had been discovered and the first 5 were in production. And after this initial phase of very high success rates, the new SO-BHP discoveries were limited throughout the early 1970s to cobia, sunfish and hapaku. There have been, excuse me, Deputy Speaker, there have been many more wells drilled, notably West Tuna in 1984 was the last of the giant oil discoveries by the SO-BHP joint venture partners. There have been several smaller discoveries since, and there are now 24 offshore platforms and installations in Bass Strait which feed a network of about 600 kilometres of underwater pipelines and keep the oil and gas flowing 24 hours a day. While production will continue for many years to come, the depleted sections of the basin are of particular interest for carbon storage and the subject of the legislation before the House today. Deputy Speaker, I make these points to highlight my view that when it comes to dealing with the complex issues and the claimed impacts of climate change, when it comes to the government's carbon pollution reduction scheme as well, Gippslanders have a very keen interest in the outcome. We are very much at the pointy end of this debate. It's our jobs that will be directly affected in the oil and gas industry, in agriculture and most significantly in the power industry in the Latrobe Valley. And as I indicated in my maiden speech, if we're prepared to give the planet the benefit of the doubt and we accept that climate change is real, then we are going to need a strong and sustainable economy to deal with the challenges it presents. In my region, there are forecasts of storm surges and sea level rises, while I may personally doubt the extent and the veracity of some of these claims, if those scenarios are accurate, it will cost billions of dollars to relocate public infrastructure and mitigate against the damage in low-lying coastal towns. And I do liken the issue to the issue of household insurance. I don't expect my house to burn down, but I will take out insurance every year just in case. And in relation to the climate change forecast, I have some serious doubts about some of the claims, but I'm not prepared to rule them out completely, and I am prepared to take action which is proportionate to that threat. My insurance in this regard is to support the practical and sustainable action which is good for the environment, but I'm not prepared to sacrifice our economic future in the process. We need to be tackling these challenges from a position of economic strength, which draws into sharp perspective the reckless spending spree of the Rudd government. I fear the government's debt and deficit binge has left the cupboard bare. Deputy Speaker, in relation to the legislation before the House, Gippsland will need to be at the forefront of research and development to successfully capture and store carbon in the future. As the technology is developed on an industrial scale, it's likely the Gippsland Latrobe Valley will be key players. Studies have shown the Gippsland Basin has the capacity to store very large volumes of carbon dioxide. In the context of the brown coal industry, there's obviously enormous gains to be made in the future, but it will take time and it's not going to happen overnight. What concerns me is the enormous rush with which this legislation, with which the government is trying to ram through its flawed CPRS legislation. I don't believe there's been enough time to explain the potential impacts on regional communities. And as I've said before in this place, the carbon capture and storage may be the big ticket item which provides the answer to the issues facing the brown coal power generators, but we're several years away from achieving the desired result. And I agree with the previous speaker, the member for Crangamite, when he said it's not a silver bullet. I believe there'll be a suite of solutions, and I'm very confident in the capacity of the engineers at work and the scientists at work in terms of finding technology-based solutions to many of the challenges we are facing in relation to climate change. I don't believe, Deputy Speaker, it's in anyone's interest to jeopardise the economic viability of the power generators in Latrobe Valley by moving too fast or placing too heavy a burden on their operations. And I note the presence of the Minister in the room. I just refer to my earlier comments. It was great to see the Minister in Longford for the 40th anniversary of the SOBHP commemoration of the joint venture partners' activities. I've met with the power generators in Latrobe Valley, and I understand the government has too, but was anyone actually listening on the government's side of the table? Was anyone actually listening to the concerns that were being raised by the generators? Let me set the scene for the House, Deputy Speaker, in relation to the importance of the power industry in the Latrobe Valley. It is the most important industry in the region, bar none. Latrobe City commissioned an independent report into the economic importance of Latrobe Valley coal and electricity industry, and it reported back in August last year, and it makes quite compelling reading. As a local member, I fully understand the significance of these the following figures. It's estimated the value added in Latrobe City for the coal and electricity industry sectors is $802 million per year, or 21.2% of the gross regional product. There are 125 people employed in the coal mining sector and 1,705 people employed in the electricity supply sector. The flow-on impacts of such a major industry is obviously very significant to the entire region in terms of the training opportunities it provides for young people, the contracting opportunities for the private sector. It's just a critically important industry for the future of our region. We have a vast reserve of brown coal in the Latrobe Valley, and it's underpinned the economic growth of Victoria. We are proud of the contribution we have made, the Latrobe Valley has made, to the wealth of this nation, and it's vital that's allowed to continue in the future. And it's been one of the frustrating aspects of the debate in relation to climate change is that the pride in our achievements in providing that baseload power supply to the community over many decades has now been eroded to some extent, and the media coverage of Latrobe Valley smokestacks on a nightly basis is actually quite disappointing for the people who live in the community. They are very proud of the contribution they've made to making Australia the great nation it is today through the supply of cheap and reliable form of energy. And it's something that I continue to encourage my community to be proud of their achievements in the past, but also look forward with confidence in the future. And it's a cautionary note, I believe, for the government in terms of how it handles the issue of climate change in the communities, which are seen to be being portrayed, I believe, unfairly as the villains in the whole debate. The Shadow Minister touched on many of the issues that have been raised by the Energy Supply Association of Australia in its negotiations with the government regarding the issue of the CPRS and the legislation before the House. And the association says there are 4 critical issues which are not adequately addressed in the current CPRS design, and I won't go through them all in complete detail, but the essence of their arguments relates to that need for certainty and ongoing financial viability of the existing assets. In an environment where there is global economic uncertainty and the generators are seeking to refinance billions of dollars to continue their operation, there needs to be sufficient information for investors to commit to long-lived capital assets. The industry is trying to engage with the government, and so is the opposition in that regard. We do have time to get this right, and the government must take the time to fully inform the community about the impact of this legislation. For example, the CEO of Loy Yang Power, Ian Nethercote, has cautioned that previous reports could be seriously underestimating the real impact on electricity prices. There is a lot, Deputy Speaker, there is a lot riding on these very complex issues in relation to the CPRS and, of course, the legislation before the House today, and we must not be getting ahead of ourselves and placing Australian jobs at risk. Just last month, Deputy Speaker, we had the release of one of the most alarming reports yet in relation to the impact on jobs. The report, titled "Securing Small and Medium Enterprises in Australia's Low Carbon Future," should be ringing alarm bells across the nation, particularly in regional areas. I'm concerned that we haven't had a single word of caution from those opposite, particularly the regional MPs. The member for Charlton and now the Minister assisting the Minister for Climate Change seems to have undergone a complete transformation. Once the great champion of working families, he does stand in this place and very rarely mentions the impact of the CPRS on jobs, particularly in his own community. I'm concerned that Labor regional MPs in the coal mining seats are silent on this issue. There's not a peep. It's the silence of the lambs, Deputy Speaker. It's as if some of them are told to just come here, turn up, sit down, shut up and vote when we tell you to. And I'm very disappointed that some of them aren't prepared to at least raise the concerns that their regional constituents are putting to them. I have a very completely different view about my role as a representative of a community which has a strong dependence on the coal industry and the brown coal-fired power generators. You can't come here and be the Marcel Marceau of government. You need to actually get up and speak out on behalf of your constituents. If we rush down this path of the Rudd government's model, we run the risk of sending our jobs overseas to countries which don't have an emissions trading scheme, and our economic circumstances will deteriorate. We must stand up for jobs in our regions. We need to be in a position of financial strength to mitigate any impacts of a changing climate. I fear that under this government's current approach, we will be sending jobs overseas and there will be an increase in total global emissions at the same time, and we will be poorly placed to undertake mitigation measures if they are ever required. Back to the report on the CPRS on the impact on small and medium-sized businesses, and this report is an independent report. It was released by the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and as I said, the findings are alarming. I'll quote a couple of aspects of the key results. Our findings show that the CPRS will generate additional costs that would erode firm profitability at the market levels of between 4 to 7% on average. In some cases, we found that the impact of additional carbon costs would erode firm profitability entirely. Erosion of firm profitability at these average levels could be significant enough to change investment incentives. And further, over time, relatively high domestic transport and freight costs will stimulate a geographic realignment towards increased urbanisation and reduced rural and regional economic activity. And again, the anticipated geographic realignment may create second and third order effects that increase the economic impact from covering transport fuels in the CPRS. For instance, structural unemployment is likely to rise due to a draining of economic activity from more remote regions. Deputy Speaker, as I said, there are some alarm bells in these comments from the ACCI. The increased urbanisation reflection is an issue that I believe is probably an unintended consequence in terms of the government's handling of the CPRS, but it does basically warn that we risk a depopulation of regional Australia, and I, for one, would hate to see that happen. But judging by some other Labor governments and their, at state level and the handling of issues of water buybacks, I fear that there is an intention there. It's much easier to manage a population if they're not living in these rural and regional locations, and it's a real concern for all MPs from regional localities. Deputy Speaker, just reflecting also on the some reports that have come directly to this place through the Senate's report on climate policy, and the recommendation enclosed within, it also reflects heavily on the legislation we have before the House and the opportunity to take the time to get this right. Among its recommendations, the Senate's report on climate policy makes the point very clearly there's a need to accurately model the impact of the CPRS in the context of the changed global financial circumstances and the impact it will have on individual regions. And I refer to the recommendations where the committee says the committee considers the modelling undertaken by Treasury to be inadequate and recommends that the government direct Treasury to undertake further modelling, and lists a whole range of areas where the modelling is required. It also goes on to say the committee recommends that the CPRS legislation not be passed in its current form. Now, obviously, that was prior to the CPRS being knocked back in the previous sitting weeks, but I think it's still relevant today when we look at what's going to happen in the next few months in terms of, one, we have a position here where we're looking at what technological opportunities are there for climate change mitigation, if you like, but also in terms of how we're going to play out in the world scheme of things. Do we wait until we actually get some indication from the global community in relation to where it's prepared to move in terms of total global emissions? And I, for one, would certainly suggest we should be waiting and taking the time to get it right. I call on the government to commission the modelling that's referred to by the Senate report on the impact on individual regions. I fear that without that model we're actually flying blind, and I also fear that we're we're misleading our communities by not telling them what the true impacts are. I think that there's a general consensus in our community that there is an issue with climate variability, call it climate change, call it what you like, but there's a general acceptance in the community that looking after the environment is a very important initiative and something that we are all very conscious of. But I don't believe that we've ever actually come clean with the community and told them what the costs are going to be, what the real impacts are going to be in some of these regional communities. And as I said earlier, the Gippsland-Latrobe Valley region is very much at the pointy end of any decisions that are made in terms of our agricultural industries, the oil and gas sector and, of course, the power sector. So I do believe we need to keep a very firm sense of perspective in this debate regarding these issues of energy security and, in this case, of the legislation before the House, the carbon capture and storage technology. Given that our nation's contribution to the global greenhouse gas emissions is less than 2%, we need to be extremely mindful of this of the international effort. How far is international community prepared to go in partnership with Australia? I believe that any policy which results in job losses in my region will have an adverse impact on every part of community life, and the government must take time to accurately model the likely impacts and come clean with the Australian public. We need to be telling Australians what the cost will be in terms of potential job losses, in terms of energy prices, fuel prices and the overall cost of living. I am concerned, Deputy Speaker, that the Prime Minister does stand in this place and talks about saving Kakadu and the Great Barrier Reef, but he never talks about the cost. And it is a ridiculous proposition in any case, as if Australia acting alone can actually achieve anything that's going to even come remotely close to saving Kakadu or the Great Barrier Reef, with our total contribution of less than 2% of total global emissions. It is farcical for the Prime Minister to stand in this place and make those claims. We can't act alone if we are serious about trying to save these icons, if indeed they are even jeopardised. And that's a whole different argument we can have. But once the community accepts we need to take action, but acting alone and ahead of the world without any global commitment to the reduction in emissions is a farcical situation. And I call on the Prime Minister to start being more honest with the Australian community about what can really be achieved by Australia taking action in this manner and what the cost will really be. It may be sacrilege for those opposite, but there are many people who have a more pragmatic and practical approach to this issue, and they don't blindly extol some of the virtues of the extreme green religion. They're prepared to act prudently and not sacrifice Australian jobs in the process. And I would rather see this debate focused on issues which all Australians can support, rather than this juvenile typecasting we're seeing of sceptics or true believers. Deputy Speaker, there is an overwhelming sentiment and goodwill in the community for action to protect and sustain the environment and for future generations to enjoy some of these great attractions that we do have across our nation. And there's no question that Gippslanders are no different to Australians in this regard. We're passionate about our local environment. We have magnificent beaches, forests and local waterways, but we are very practical people. We have thousands of people who are involved as volunteers in groups like Landcare, who are getting their hands dirty and doing the practical environmental work that's required, despite cuts in funding that we've seen by the Rudd government. It was amazing to listen to the Minister for Agriculture in this place yesterday, shamelessly promoting the 20-year anniversary of Landcare, but not even referring to the fact that the massive cuts in the number of Landcare facilitators across Victoria, which has occurred on his watch. As I mentioned in my previous contribution to the House, we have the real practical environmentalists in our communities in regional areas. There are our farmers and the other landholders who are investing in their whole-of-farm plans to reduce nutrient runoff into local streams and undertake a range of practical works. We have many industries who are investing in technology to clean up their operations, and I think the brown coal power industry will obviously be partners in anything that comes out of the legislation before the House today. But there is still a great deal of confusion about climate change and the government's proposed response with the emissions trading scheme. We do need a proper debate, and fair and open and honest debate, in a language that people can understand exactly what we're actually talking about. Deputy Speaker, I take up the contributions from other members in relation to this legislation, and the member for Werriwa in particular, who pointed out there won't be just one approach to these very complex issues. I agree wholeheartedly. In a country parlance, I'd suggest that there is more than one way to skin a cat. There will be a suite of measures required in terms of carbon capture and storage, in terms of the initiatives to look at ways to store carbon in the soil, and also in terms of the whole suite of measures in relation to renewable energy forms, which have general support of the House, given the passage of the RET legislation quite recently. Deputy Speaker, just like the member Flinders who spoke previously and extensively about a range of other options for sustainably managing the environment, I believe there are many options which need to be fully explored in relation to this, in addition to this carbon capture and storage legislation. We need to be acting responsibly, and in my mind acting responsibly includes protecting our energy security and our base load power supply from the Gippsland Latrobe Valley region, and we need to be acting in a way that protects jobs for the future of the Gippsland community. I commend the previous speakers and commend the Minister for his interest in the legislation. His attendance in Gippsland earlier this year was much appreciated by the community, and also commend the former Minister for the work he's done in this area, and I thank the House.